Tonight we are talking about the history of free will. So our topic tonight is the history of free will, and this follows a kind of a series of lectures that we're doing on this particular topic, free will and determinism, one of the kind of core questions in philosophy. Last couple months ago when we did our first one of these, we were simply just trying to grapple with the topic. And so in a lot of cases, people, because, for example, everybody has kind of an intuitive sense that we are making decisions, and that I could right now continue to give this lecture, or I could walk right out this door and you guys would wonder where I went, and that would maybe just be an illustration of free will, if I were to actually do that. On the other hand, well, even though we have that sense, there's several philosophical problems that come with it. And so we were trying to grapple with those in our first topic, and so we'll do a little bit of a recap. But this time what we're trying to do is put the development of people's thinking about this topic into historical context. So we'll look at some of the earliest notions that people have when history begins and we have writing and we can kind of trace people's ideas. And we'll go through antiquity and get up to, we're going to get into the Middle Ages, and we're not going to get too much into modern times, I'm going to tell you. So this is part one. So by tonight, there's a lot of development. So I'll mention that our ability to have this meet up both here and also to be able to stream it online to you is thanks to your generous donations. So we appreciate that you donate. And also for those joining online, you can always go to our website, centerplace.ca, and if you scroll down, you'll find PayPal buttons, and you can use those to donate. And as always, we really appreciate your contributions as we are viewer supported. Okay, so this is a recap from our previous lecture, and so just dealing with the general scope of what is this question. So free will, there's all kinds of different ways we can define this, but one of the ways we can define it is the ability to choose between different possible courses of action unimpeded. So do we actually have the ability to choose between multiple courses of action? I could do, right now eat an apple, or right now eat a cupcake. And am I able to, either one of those possibilities, am I not impeded from actually making those kind of choices? Or determinism, which we can define here as that all events are determined by previous existing causes. So the fact that, let's say, if I were here with an apple and a cupcake, should have had an example where I actually have the things in my hands. I don't. Anyway, if I were here, then something would have caused that apple to be here and the cupcake to be here and me to be here. And something would have caused me to have my interior predilections to whether I would, let's say, pick one above the other in the context where I'm at. And so there are all of these causes that would happen, and that those all naturally follow along each other. And even though I have very obviously, and very, as you all do, the illusion that I'm making a free choice between them, in point of fact, it's what I would have done was always what I would have done, because I always am going to, if there was ever going to be all of those things all factored in, all the factors, it would always be that I would pick the apple, let's say, because I would always want to show how I pick the harder to eat thing over the delicious cupcake, right? Whatever it would be. Okay, there's that apple and cupcake. There it is. So we have this. Is that you? Yeah, that's me. That's the inner me that's going to take the cupcake, right? So we have this intuitive sense of and belief in free will, generally. Most humans, then, we seem to have that. We deliberate and form our perspective. From our perspective, seem to choose between alternatives that are equally open. And indeed, as people have studied people's perception of this being the case, it develops very early in children. And as we've looked at with some of these studies, whereas there are sometimes cultural differences between let's say things that we think are pretty innate to our culture, we find out, oh, those actually are kind of Western values as opposed to Eastern values. Categorization is one of the things that we've talked about. as being a little different, west and east. But this, on the other hand, seems to be pretty universal, that people believe that they are making choices. So our shared intuitive sense of free will, if we just put this on kind of a timeline, we have a sense that there's the past. There's only one past. The past is fixed. We can't go back and do anything about it. We're in the present. We have free will then in our kind of perception, and that gives us the option to choose between these multiple possibilities in the unwritten future, which, depending on our choices, will create potential futures that will be different from each other based on what we do, right? However, so for the other side of it, despite that intuition, we also, I think, understand that we're the product of our genes and our environment. We sometimes have the debate, are we more the product of our genes or are we more the product of our environment? But if you add up both, that's kind of what we're the product of, we kind of think. And so isn't it then true that we'll always act in such a way as our genes and our environment have combined to make inevitable? So for example, even if I pick an uncharacteristic pick, let's say, the apple over the cupcake, wouldn't that be predictable if a computer existed with sufficient information? So in other words, if you were to be able to figure out like all of the things about me and everything I've ever done before, and all of the circumstances that we're in, and all of the other factors in the whole universe that have led up to when I'm about to make that choice, if there's a sufficiently powerful computer with all of that information, wouldn't it always be able to predict what we would do? Because what else is there in us than all the things that we have that make the sum of our whole, right? So that's the problem. So if there's, under this case, in terms of determinism, then there's only one past that's fixed. Our actions are determined by what went before. Our present free will is an illusion. There really is only the one potential future ever, because the other futures was never actually possible, right? If everything's determined. We just thought it was going to be possible. We predicted that it was possible that whatever, everything that exists, everything has happened in history might have had another outcome, right? Or, and finally, as we kind of grappled with it, or have we just framed the problem wrong, where we think that these two things are incompatible with each other, that determination, in other words, the determinism, the fact that this was always going to happen this way, that doesn't necessarily mean we didn't have free will somehow, if we can figure out how to make that, to square that circle, and so this is what is called compatibilism. And so there was only the one past. We were definitely going to have that future, but maybe nevertheless, we did still exercise some kind of free will in order to make that future happen, even though it was always going to happen. And so, is that possible somehow? Elizabeth isn't sure about that one. We did talk about it last time, that most philosophers anyway are, I think, they're still open on this. This is an open question. So there are a bunch of philosophers that are hard free will libertarians who believe that these are totally incompatible. There are hard determinists who believe that these are totally incompatible and that we do not therefore have free will. And then there are compatibilists, and this is the plurality position, or the more of them, or more philosophers are in this kind of camp, that somehow these two ideas are not in opposition to each other, and that there's some way we can make this compatible. But they're not all agreeing with each other, because there's all kinds of different ways that could be compatible, right? So they all have different theories about that. Okay, so that's kind of our recap, I think, of how it all goes. So with that compatibilism, are you free if you think you're free? So sometimes the way classical philosophers have framed the debate, it's based on external constraint. So if we think, for example, if you're a prisoner, you're not free to choose things because you're in a jail, so you can't just go out and do whatever you would be able to do if you're not a prisoner, right? More recent times, this has definitely gone inside, and so we're not only dealing with constraints that are whether or not you're in jail, it's things whether or not, let's say, if you have an addiction or you have some other kind of things, are you able to exercise free choice based on those kind of internal constraints that we're now more aware of in modern times than in antiquity or classical times, but this is kind of where they were at all the way up through early modern times. What if the jailer told the prisoner, oopsie, I did these in reverse order, it's this one. What if the jailer told the prisoner that he'd left the cell door unlocked so that he could leave at any time, but the prisoner then chose to stay inside the cell? So he's a prisoner, he could leave theoretically, but he doesn't because he chooses to stay in there. And then the third component here, let's go this way. But what if the jailer then was lying? The prisoner had chosen to stay in there, but in fact it actually was locked, and you wouldn't have gotten out anywhere. So it is the potential for the alternate activity, is that actually relevant? Is the choosing relevant? In other words, is a prisoner making the choice? Is that what's relevant here? Does the door have to actually be, does he actually have to have the potential for having the outcome realized to make it real? Or does it work here even if he just thinks he had the potential to get out and he never really did, and he chooses to stay in there? In other words, he chooses the only real potential one, and he just thinks there's a multiple potential. Is that still free will? Or is that just a sham of free will? And so these are arguments for and against compatibilism, right? Okay, so like I say, tonight's goal, we're going to talk about the developments of the idea of free will, and this is going to be the lecture tonight, part 1, beginnings. And so where is this origins immediately coming from? So I think that historians have traced the idea of people questioning about free will and determinism based on the fact that in ancient societies, slavery was ubiquitous. So it's an institution that all of the different societies have. And so at the beginning of recorded history, the fact that there was slave societies, that there were free and enslaved peoples, that also framed the idea of free will. So on its surface, if they're thinking about it, ancient people observed a free man as someone who is able to do what he likes, whereas a slave has to do what he is told, right? But when people thought about it for a second, wait a second, since a lot of, let's say, these thinkers actually have slaves, they tell their slaves to do all kinds of things or order them or whatever, and the slaves can still have the capacity whether or not they're going to do it sometimes. I mean, they may well be punished or not, but there's all kinds of things that are subject to their own choosing within it. And then, of course, even among free people in antiquity, there were also constraints. So, for example, you would be subject still to kings or laws or any number of kinds of things that prevent you from having totally free exercise of your individual unchecked liberty. And ultimately, for people in antiquity, they would say to themselves, even kings have to do what the gods are ordering them to do, or let's say obey divine law and nature. You can't go against the laws of physics, as Scotty always says on the Enterprise. And if you do, like he usually does, then you were supposed to anyway suffer consequences, as the gods will strike you down for your hubris and that kind of a thing. So in other words, it's more nuanced right from the start than people were maybe even thinking. Okay, so at that same earliest time in ancient Greece, for example, at the beginnings of when we start having written literature, and so we can actually trace what people are at first thinking. These are, as the oral epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey are written down, some of the earliest thought. The Greeks at that point already have developed the idea of fate. We still have that word, and we still talk about it, and some people say, well, it's fate if that this had happened, or was that kind, or destiny. So these are similar concepts from all the way back to antiquity. So the idea of fate is that there are certain events that just have to happen, that they're going to happen regardless. And so in the Iliad, in the Trojan War, it's fated, and everybody knows it, that the Trojans are going to lose this war. Troy is fated to fall, and it didn't matter what the Trojans decide to do, because it's going to fall because of fate. And even it doesn't matter that they have a bunch of gods on their side too. So There's a bunch of gods that are fighting on the side of the Greeks, but there are other gods that are siding on the Trojan side, including Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares. And indeed here, this kind of famous statue, the Trojan prophet Laocoon and his sons, he actually has received a vision from Apollo, an oracle, that not to bring the Trojan horse into the town. And he says in the Aeneid, actually, quid it est, timeo daneos et dona ferentes, beware Greeks bearing gifts, do not, and so then what happens is that the god that's on the side of the Greeks sends these snakes out of the sea, and they come and they devour Laocoon and his sons. And so then the Trojans are like, well, he said to beware the Greeks, but then he got killed. So maybe what the gods are telling us is we should take the horse inside. And so anyway, so they fulfill their fate despite the fact that they have this forewarning, right? Okay. So according to fate as it's understood then by the ancient Greeks, it doesn't matter what you do to try to avoid your fate. So the most classic example of this is the story of Oedipus. And so in that classic myth about trying to escape fate, there's a king and queen, Laius and Jocasta, who are in charge of Thebes. They have a son. That son's fate is to kill Laius and to marry Jocasta, so just the worst kind of fate you could possibly have. And so they do what people in antiquity do when they have an unwanted child, which is exposure. So you leave the infant out, and essentially you're leaving it to the gods what happens, but generally speaking, the infant dies of exposure, or the wild animals or anything like that. And so that's the, antiquity version of family planning. And so what they do, though, is they take the kid, not only, they're not even going to risk it in terms of just leaving a kid in a basket like Moses or with anybody else, who, anything can happen. They make it so the kid isn't going to get away because they pierce his heel here and have him, tied to the mountains or chained to the mountains so that he's not going to get away. But anyway, a shepherd finds him, as is wont to happen, and the shepherd rescues the kid and wants to save it and gives it to the king and queen of Corinth. And so they raise the little boy as their own, and that's why it's called Oedipus, because he's had this thing happen to his feet. So anyway, puss there. Anyway, when Oedipus becomes an adult, he himself then goes to the Oracle of Delphi, and he learns that he has this horrible, horrible fate, that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, whom he presumes are the king and queen of Corinth, people who he has grown up with and who have raised him. And so he wants to avoid this terrible fate, and so he decides he's going to move very far away from Corinth. He's going to go to some other city. He goes to decide, I'll go to Thebes to get away from this fate. And so on the way to Thebes, he is on the road. He encounters this old man. He's got to fight with him. The old man's a really quarrelsome guy, and the fight gets out of control, and he kills the old guy. Then when he gets to Thebes, he realizes that he finds out, the queen of Thebes is recently been widowed. And so maybe, this is a good in for him. So he marries her so that he can now become king of Thebes. And of course, it's only later that he realizes that when he starts to investigate the murder, that actually the person who had killed her deceased husband is, of course, him, and she, of course, is his mother, and that had been his father in terms of a biological parenthood. And when that happens, of course, then that's the horrible finding out of the tragedy, and he takes his eyes and has to spend the rest of his life, in this kind of living out this horrible fate that he's had. But there was nothing you could do to get away from the fate, right? So they did everything, and it still happened. So over time, as Greek ideas about fate and their pagan religion evolved, the fates become personified, and so they become seen as these three goddesses who are at a loom. There is generally a young woman, a middle-aged woman, and an old woman, and so representing kind of this life cycle. And the young one is the spinner. Lachesis, the allottor, Atropos, the unturnable, which is to say the person who's in charge of death. They spin a life into being, they thread it through life's tapestry, all of the different things that might happen, and ultimately the Atropos cuts the thread, and that's when your life is cut short, and that's how much time fate has allotted to you. And so there is no, that's all fated right between there. Even the gods are subject to fate. So in another playwright, Aeschylus, who wrote Prometheus Bound, he wrote, the fates might, to the fates the might of Zeus must bow, and by the immortal's purpose all these things had come to pass, or by Morais the fates' ordinance. And so the logical implications of this are figured out not too long after this by the development of Greek philosophy, and some philosophers essentially write satires and even ridicule this view. And there's a big dialogue that one of these philosophers.
What is that thing that he has on his hand?
He's holding a lightning bolt. The question was, what is Zeus there holding? So Zeus is the god of lightning and thunder. So his sigil is to hold a lightning bolt. And so the philosopher is having a dialogue with Zeus, and he's asking Zeus, why should I sacrifice to you? Whatever you're going to do has already been fated. So whether you're going to kill me or not is already, pre-fated. So why should I offer you a sacrifice? And Zeus argues with him back and forth, and he's, essentially the guy always points the point. Doesn't matter what I do at this point, because it's already fated what's going to happen. And so Zeus, I think, in the dialogue ultimately agrees with him, and so the guy gets away with it. So in a world governed by fate, then, does anybody have free will? If your fate is inevitable, is it possible to exercise free will? So in some sense, there might be a kind of free will here, even in this kind of fatalistic understanding. So Oedipus and his natural parents are seemingly able to make choices and cause different futures. Okay. Based on their foreknowledge of fate, right? So they know what's going to happen because of oracles and things like that. And so that knowledge gets sent back to them, essentially, or that foreknowledge is given to them, and they make choices. And so their life goes on potentially different paths. So they act in such a way that the baby doesn't just grow up in Thebes. But so who knows if that's a potential path or not. But anyway, it's seemingly different paths. But unfortunately for them, all of those paths lead to the same place, or the other paths are just illusion. So one way or the other, you're getting to experience that fate. Okay, so this brings us to, like the philosopher was having with Zeus. Whenever we're dealing with free will and determinism, when you get to the place where you're worried that everything is predetermined, people will make what's called the lazy argument. And so this is spelled out really well by a 3rd century Christian philosopher and theologian, Origen, probably the first really, really smart Christian, I would say, in terms of being able to write all this stuff out. Anyway, so he is arguing here against the idea of fate by he's using the lazy argument here to argue that fate doesn't make any sense. So he says, if it is fated that you will recover from this illness, then, regardless of whether you consult a doctor or you do not consult a doctor, you will recover. You're fated to recover. It doesn't matter if you go to the doctor. But also, if it's fated that you won't recover from this illness, then, regardless of whether you consult a doctor or you do not consult a doctor, you will not recover. So, if there's fate, you're fated to recover or not. You may not know what your fate is. That's not irrelevant here as far as Origen is concerned. What he's saying, logically, you're going to have one or the other. That's what fate is, right? And so, if it is either fated that you will recover from this illness or it is fated that you won't recover. Therefore, it is futile to consult a doctor. And in antiquity, it usually was futile. It was actually half and half. It's a coin toss. The doctor has a 50% chance of making it better and a 50% chance of making it worse. There's some things that actually make it better. So the fact that you get attention, there's all these kind of things where this is one of the reasons why all sorts of what am I going to call whatever alternative or pseudoscientific things actually still work, because placebo is a very powerful thing, as is personal will and just even having human contact. All of these kind of things are actually very, very helpful. And so in those cases, nursing is really good. And so in those cases in antiquity, the kind of humorism, which is the ancient Greek and all the way through to early modern Western medical ideas, whereas they are not based on actual physical reality in terms of how they work. Nevertheless, and so if they bloodlet you and you got infected from being bloodlet, you're going to die from that. That's bad. But if they gave you too much tinctures of mercury or something like that and poison you, I mean, that's going to be bad. But if they gave you a poultice and they rubbed your belly and I mean, whatever, it may well be that you got better than you wouldn't have because you got ignored. So this kind of a thing. That's what's possible. But in any event, if there was fate was operating, you shouldn't have gone to the doctor. There's no point. What's the difference? Okay. Another objection that people kind of had to fate as people started developing philosophically in the ancient Greeks, and they're coming up more with how to live a good life, how to be ethical, and all those kind of things. The one thing about the fates as they're described in these kind of things is that they appear to be arbitrary or maybe amoral. So there's actually no sense that there was any reason why the fates assigned Oedipus his fate. It seems essentially arbitrary, chaotic, and devoid of meaning, right? And so this is something that people found unsatisfying increasingly. So same ideas are happening at other places around the world, and so I want to look over to South Asia here and talk about the development of the idea of karma in South Asia. So the authors of the early Upanishads, 7th century BC, that's roughly contemporary to Homer's Iliad. They're also developing the idea of cause and effect. And so causation, the fact that one thing causes another, is really at the heart of karma, which is translated a bunch of different ways: action, deed, and even also intent. So, I mean, this is going to be gross simplification just like fate was, but anyway, karma holds that the executed actions of an individual, so things that you actually do, and the affects the individual who executes them, and also the life that they live, and also then your intentions similarly affect you and also the life you live. So both what you do and also your intentions. This is an image of karma, which is how it's endlessly connected and circling around to itself. And there it is again, you can see on the little bell in the middle there, that same image. So karma, however, as opposed to fate, which seemed arbitrary and maybe amoral, does have interwoven with it very tightly ethical consequences. So in contrast to that randomness, we can read here in one of the Upanishads, "Now as a man is like this or that, according as he acts and according as he behaves, so will he be. A man of good acts will become good, a man of bad acts bad. He becomes pure by pure deeds, bad by bad deeds." And then this goes on and does the same refrain with intentions. So by good intentions, you become good, bad intentions, bad. So karma. This is also, though, interwoven with the same question of free will and then indeed moral agency. So we're talking about ethics here and good and bad. If you are everything is determined, let's say, you have this question about whether you have any moral agency. If you had no choice but to do it, can you really be held blameworthy for having done that? So it's one of the core problems with the questions with free will and determinism. So does a person living within a universe governed by karma have free will? So for example, one of the counter arguments that people make, if you hurt somebody, are you maybe merely acting as an agent of their karma? So they maybe need to be delivered necessary punishment because of something that they've either done wrong in their life now or because of something that they have done in past life where they've caused bad karma, and doesn't that have to come back to them somehow anyway? And weren't you then just being the agent of karma without it being your own free agency, right? That's one possibility. if somebody though so victimizes you, should you blame this guy for doing this thing to you, or should you blame yourself and understand that all the suffering you have is really the result of your own karma, the fact that either now or in a past life you have caused this and brought this upon yourself? The lazy argument, we're going to get to this everywhere. So once you have this thing, then people also bring up, if all suffering is deserved and is the consequence of past lives, so why do we want to learn anything when the balance sheet of karma from past life determines our own action and sufferings? So anyway, these are all kind of possibilities. The different strains from South Asia, the different religions and ethical systems that emerge, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they each make somewhat different and subtle arguments or counters to all these. So that's not that people don't have answers, they do. Most of these answers we're all going to find in antiquity and all through the Middle Ages that we're doing tonight are going to all be this compatibilist zone that we've been talking about. So they make compatibilist arguments against objections to karma and free will. And so, for example, a major symbol in South Asia is this idea of the lotus, and it's because the lotus is this amazingly beautiful thing that emerges out of swamp, out of muck. And so the idea of it is, even if you are in a circumstance where you had, there's been bad karma and you maybe have been in this kind of sludge of the muck, it's still possible that good things can grow and emerge out of it. Sir? If you're not going to be just sitting and listening, we'll probably have to ask you to go, because, all right. Okay, so if we pull back that same kind of thing to what this same kind of wrestling that is happening, past just Greco-Roman pagan fatalism to where this ethical dimensions are emerging in Greek philosophy, so the Stoics. The Stoics also, for example, and all the other Greco-Roman moral philosophies of the time inject ethics into their idea of fatalism. So in other words, the fact that the fates do seem amoral, that doesn't really work for people who now are increasingly interested in ethics. So the Stoics believe that everything is connected. Stoicism emerged. Are we okay?
I just lost some belongings up there.
Really? Okay, let's pause for a second.
Just wanted to check. Somebody was checking to make sure the right coat was taken.
I'm just standing here.
Okay.
It's okay.
So, okay. We're okay.
I hope so.
Okay, so let's just pause and come back, and we'll go ahead and restart. So, talking about how, based on that background, which comes out of Greek paganism, fates had looked immoral or amoral. And so Stoicism is one of the philosophies that develops, and in fact it becomes the most popular philosophy in the Roman Empire. The Stoics believe that everything is connected, and in fact the universe itself is ultimately God. For the Stoics, God, who's the first cause of everything, is also good. So all events have been foreordained to achieve ultimately positive results. So God is the origin of everything, the first mover of which the first cause, and everything is all caused in a chain from this Stoic God. And so ultimately, even apparent evils, as far as the Stoics are concerned, actually are for good ends, in the same way that touching your hand to the stove causes pain, but that pain is actually good because it teaches you not to put your hand on the stove. So that's essentially the Stoic idea of good and evil, and also essentially how everything is determined by this same kind of world universe God, which is that the universe is God. So just to have it kind of explained, causation, the prime mover and fate. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus wrote, if any motion exists without a cause, then not every proposition will be either true or false, for that which has not efficient causes is neither true or false. So this is an argument that ancient Greeks are kind of very interested in terms of causation, that everything that exists has to be caused by something. So the reason why this podium is here is because somebody built it, somebody bought it, someone gave it to us, and now I dragged it out here and set it up in front of the camera, and so now we have it. Nothing is around nothing happened anywhere or exists anywhere without it having some chain of those causes, that goes all the way back to when, this was a tree and before a seed and every other kind of thing. And so logically, what he's kind of trying to say is, if something just comes into being without any kind of reason, without any kind of cause, then there's no sense of anything. Nothing is true or false. He's questioning whether logic itself exists. Every proposition is either true or false. Therefore, there's no motion without a cause. And if this is so, then all effects owe their existence to prior causes. And if this is so, all things happen by fate, as far as he's concerned. Because if you take all of those causes back one after the other, so this is an argument in a way for determinism, it's going to go all the way back to whatever that first cause is, which he's going to say is God and fate, and it follows therefore that whatever happens by fate. Nevertheless, Chrysippus argues on behalf of a preservation of a kind of free will, and so therefore to get into this zone of compatibilism, right? So everything is predetermined, but there's also room to exercise individual free will. So, for example, so speaking of coats, which hopefully didn't get destroyed just now out there, but anyway, the non-destruction of one's coat, if one's coat is going to continue to be preserved, that's not simply fated, but he suggests it is co-fated with its being taken care of. So in other words, the coat was going to be preserved no matter what, but the way that was going to happen is because of people taking care of the coat. And so it's co-fated. And if someone is being saved from his enemies, is co-fated with him fleeing those enemies. So you are fated to do that, but you're also fated to you're fated to be saved, but you're also fated to flee. You're supposed to flee in order to make your fate happen. Having children is co-fated to being willing to lie with a woman if you're a man. Yeah, I was going to say a man. You can see how philosophers are pretty sexist. So anyway, for many things that cannot occur without our being willing and indeed contributing to a most strenuous and eagerness and zeal for these things, since it was fated for these things to occur in conjunction with this personal effort, but it will be in our power with what is in our power being included in fate. And so we have to always decide how convinced we are by these compatibilist arguments. So on the one hand, everything is fated to happen, and yet we choose to make these things happen, and in so doing that, we picked free will, but was there really a possibility for us to have the other thing, and is that necessary? So as far as Chrysippus is arguing here, not really, because we have eagerly picked the thing that we were fated to do. So thus, even if you're fated to do it, you also did it of your own will, and therefore you're morally responsible, because the Stoics did like to lay blame on you for doing bad stuff. So that's compatibilism. Okay, so as we're getting now into late antiquity and into the Middle Ages, as Christians are inheriting all this stuff, they're inheriting both Athens and Jerusalem, so they're inheriting both Greco-Roman philosophy, but also the Hebrew scriptures. And so the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century, and Christianity absorbed Greco-Roman philosophy. And that included things like continuing to use ideas like the prime mover or first cause to describe God. And so they went right for the late Greco-Roman philosophy on these and brought that directly into Christian theology. Christians also inherited ideas from Hebrew Scripture, including the idea that God saw physical creation as good. So at the end of each day in the story of Genesis 1, God sees, the light and the darkness, and God calls the light, the light calls day, and God calls the first day good, right? And so it's always called good. And thus the material world is viewed, for example, more positively than in some of the Greco-Roman philosophies. Stoics were pretty positive about the physical world because they felt that the physical world and it had a life force within it, and altogether the universe was in fact God. So they're panentheistic. Plato and other philosophers that are following him, the Neoplatonists, believed that the physical, and we'll see this next week with the Gnostics, that the physical world is in fact grossly inferior to the spiritual world, the world of ideas and the numbers and forms, so mathematics, that's the pure world of spirit and ideas, of which our physical world is a very crude, inferior reflection, and in some cases, as we'll see with like the Gnostics, one to be gotten rid of. And so Gnostics will often, for example, think we shouldn't be procreating because we shouldn't be trapping more incredible divine spirits within physical prisons. So it's a very negative view of the physical world, in contrast here to Christians who still have this kind of sensibility of they want to mortify the flesh. The flesh has problems, but nevertheless creation is good, right? So it's not as negative as Plato. So the great thinker that brings all this together in the Christianity is Augustine. So he's really influenced by Neoplatonism, and so as he is thinking about good and evil, he pulls in Neoplatonic ideas, explaining that one of the things we have to deal with is if the creation is good and the creator is good, why is there so much evil in the world? So that's the philosophical problem of evil. Augustine's solution that he borrows from Neoplatonism is that evil isn't actually a thing. The only thing that is good, and evil is just absence of good. And so he argues that it's not black and white, it is light and dark. And so light is a thing, and darkness is simply absence of light, right? So darkness is not a thing in and of itself. So that's the idea from Neoplatonism and also Christianity. Augustine further taught that the divine image in which God had created humans, so in the beginning again in Genesis, in the image of God created he, male and female created he them, it says. What really is talking about there is not your physical body, because God is not being with a limited physical body at all, but rather is the power of reason, including this free will to choose possible outcomes, including between good and evil, and that the whole reason that humans were in let's say, the kind of degraded condition we're in, which is to say when we're finding ourselves in a world that's filled with suffering. So why are we in that kind of world of suffering? Because throughout time, humans have continued to misuse that judgment in terms of exercising free will and choosing bad, and in so doing then causing suffering for others and for themselves. So that's anyway his explanation for that, whether we find that to be suitable or not, or as an explanation for the problem of evil. So even though he's totally all in on free will, that's not the whole picture isn't totally complete for people who nevertheless now have really kind of picked an idea where they're focused also on the idea of a good, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. So if there's a God that is good, that is all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing, and all good, why again is there? That also has implications for free will and determinism. So again, although free will is the cause of human suffering, nevertheless, individuals can't just take themselves out of this condition of suffering and go to be perfect with God. You can't achieve this kind of salvation where you will have union with the one, with the good, simply by our own agency. We can't just keep exercising free will and do all kinds of charity and somehow that's going to get us there, because he suggests that the gap between the infinite, between God and where we're at, is infinite. And so in Augustine's formulation, you have to have something else to do that. And indeed, if we were to be trying to buy our way, he argues, to heaven by keeping on doing all these good acts, and if those good acts actually brought us in, or if we're trying to escape punishment, like in hellfire or something like that, by either doing good acts or avoiding bad acts, then that would actually compromise our motivation. And so even though it may well be that some Christians think that if they do all these good things, they're going to go to heaven, and if they do all these bad things, they're going to go to hell, in point of fact, actually, that's completely against Christian doctrine. That's not what is causing it. Anything you do in terms of bad acts does not actually buy you into hell, and good acts don't actually get you a reward in heaven, because in fact, that's not the mechanism for a decision about what's going to happen in terms of whether you're, eternal destiny. So instead, God alone has the capacity to bestow salvation through infinite grace. And that, by the way, does seem to raise again the specter of determinism. Well, if God is determining that, does your free will really matter? We're getting back to that place where, okay, yes, maybe there's a bunch of different paths that give Oedipus on the road to either Thebes or Corinth or wherever he's going to go. But at the end of the story, he's still, killing his dad, and marrying his mom. So you're either going to be in heaven or hell, right? Okay. So predestination, determinism, and having this omniscient creator. So God knowing everything is also maybe a problem for whether or not you can exercise free will. So if there is a being, or if there is being and all things are known, including everything that you're ever going to do, doesn't that limit free will? So if God knows you're going to do something before you do it, and God is the first cause and prime mover who has predestined everything in the universe, in other words, all the causes that go back to what you did as a cause, and that started with God doing it, how do you have free will? So if God knows you're going to do something, how can you be free to not do it without making God wrong? So God knew you were going to do the one thing, again, between the apple and the cupcake back then. He knows I'm picking the apple. And he knew that, like right now, and now 5 minutes from now, I've now decided, okay, I'm going to do the other. Then I retroactively made it so that God didn't know something, And so then he's not omniscient, so then he's not God. So therefore, it doesn't seem like I can do that, even though technically I've been told I have free will, right? So it does seem like this is another one of these kind of problems. So we're going to always get to compatibilism, with almost all of these solutions for ancient philosophers and also medieval thinkers. And so one of the ways Augustine tries to pull out of this problem is by asserting, this is pretty clever, asserting that God is not inside time. So God is a singularity, God is atemporal, and God isn't existing in the eternal now. So God doesn't experience time the way we do by being inside of it, where we are existing in just the human present, of which, and also we are aware of the past, but we have no access to it other than through memory and artifacts. And there's a future we anticipate, but we are not able to know it. It's totally undiscovered for us. And we don't know, frankly, if the future does actually exist yet, or if there are multiple potential futures that are in front of us that don't exist yet. So this is one of the reasons why we have this question. So for Augustine, God is outside of and is also the creator of time, so outside of time, existing in an eternal now that's beyond what we can understand. And so that may be as satisfying, but on the other hand, generally speaking for philosophy, if you say, we can't know that, that's unknowable, that's kind of cheating, and so it may not be saying anything at all, right? And so that may well not be satisfying to a lot of people. I'll just mention that I just binge watched The Watchmen, so this is a HBO show was on this last fall, and it's really well done. It's a very well done show, and so it does this this question in a very it's very hard to write this. In fact, actually, usually when people are writing shows about a character that doesn't experience time the way we do, they can't pull it off, because you can't, it's almost impossible not to experience time the way we do. But Dr. Manhattan, unlike all of the rest of us as a character in the show, is simultaneously aware of and is simultaneously existing in all of our human time frame times. And so what will happen is, I won't talk about it from the show, I'll talk about it from the movie, so it won't be a spoiler. But so let's say he's confronting his girlfriend because she's had an affair, and she says, well, how do you know that? And he says, you told me 40 minutes from now when we're having our fight on Mars. And she's like, what are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and so then later, when they are having their fight on Mars in 40 minutes, and she tells him that, or she brings it up or whatever, then he's like, how could you, you're having an affair, how could you? And she's like, you know, the whole time. He's like, anyway, but he's like, the idea of it is, in other words, that he is experiencing time differently, and it was only then that he would have been told, although he has always known it because of, anyway. So it's very interesting how they've done it, and they did it the same way in the show, and they did a good job. So I recommend it. Okay, so, but yes, Valerie.
Just,
I remember another thing about Augustine's theory of how God utterly determines us.
Yes.
And then gives us grace so that we can choose him and choose the good. Another of his solutions is that we are utterly determined, but we're not constrained. And so we can still exercise our will, even though God knows we're going to do it. And so that was one of his attempted solutions, that we're determined but not constrained.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just seems a little
So this
strange to me.
Yeah, but okay, so this is kind of like, again, going back to the Stoics, and we're going to have to spend a bunch of different time trying to wrestle with compatibilism, and I'm going to make the first one of these that we did a month or so ago. People who watched it were saying that they thought I came off as they really thought, boy, how can you be a determinist? This is so strange, But I'm not really, but I was actually trying to get into it, trying to get into the perspective of it and really kind of explain it. In this case, what I'm actually trying to do, because everybody in antiquity in the Middle Ages, generally speaking, comes up with some kind of compatibilism, like Augustine here, by making a nuance between, yes, you're determined, God is determined that we're going to do this, or this kind of way, but you still. Yeah, we aren't constrained. Yeah, we're not constrained. So, so coming up with some kind of a nuance to understand it, and so I'm going to try to make a couple pitches for compatibilism, but it's also hard to wrestle with these kind of nuances. In a lot of cases, it's also not particularly satisfying because we're concerned that, like I kind of said with the jail at the beginning, that if you only thought that the jailer told you that you could leave any time and you chose to stay in the cell, but actually you couldn't leave because it was actually locked. That still seems like a very hollow, or that's compatibilism, a caricature of compatibilism that seems quite hollow to us. Yeah. Back here. So wait for the microphone. I'm sorry.
What if there are different levels of possibility of these mechanisms operating? So for example, I don't want to get too like sci-fi-y or cheesy, but if we consider it like in the Matrix, right? And like the possibility that the Matrix is a program, if you're entrenched in it, then maybe there's more of a fatalistic or destined, like your free will isn't completely 100% free because you're a little compulsive. You don't have a certain level of awareness, maybe a certain level of mastery over your energies and over your fates and what you create. But if you can transcend that level of, I don't know if you want to call it consciousness or collective consciousness, which would be a certain level of matrix, could it be that at that level there's a different law, there's a different mechanism of operation of what you're perceiving, experiencing, creating, co-creating? Like maybe the experience of existence, God, the universe, reality, whatever you want to call it, isn't really that linear where it's like, okay, well, here's the program, that's the way it is. Like maybe there are multiple layers.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. So I'm trying to think of how you could do it, because one of the problems that, like even here with the Dr. Manhattan thing, one of the problems is that it's hard to conceive of like once you've transcended us living in like in a linear fashion, if but it may be so, right? So I don't know. That's an interesting idea of saying, well, maybe there's a different, if there's a different angle or scale, and where we're really only perceiving time this one way, but in fact, like one one philosophical theory that I've run across that's recently that has really stuck with me, and I can't remember now which philosopher has come up with this, but is the idea, it's an answer to the question of self, the problem of self, where we have this sense of that we are a self, and we have this sense of continuity, let's say, between our past self and our present self, whereas even though if we were to go back to 5-year-old me, there's actually very little that I have in common with 5-year-old me. 5-year-old me has a completely different size, body, and brain, and everything like that. Is composed of 0 of the same atoms as me. Has a completely different, relationship to the universe and everyone around him than me. And so one of the proposals of how do you even talk about there being any identity between these two possibly seemingly discrete individuals is that selves only exist in 4 dimensions, which is to say there's a time tunnel where that has been plotted through all the way up from birth till now, and the only way you can actually define me is by looking at that entire tunnel, including all of the individual instantaneous selves and adding into time. So just because it's hard for us to get out of intuitive, like for example, an intuitive sense that we do have free will and are making these choices all the time, or an intuitive sense that I'm just me and myself or something like that, there may be other ways that we can think of it that would be a different way to understand it. So that's neat, yeah. Okay. Enough of Dr. Manhattan. Okay, so we were going to go to look at, so we're talking about Christians, the same errors, other errors to the same issues, both to Greek and Roman philosophy, especially Greek, and also to Hebrew scriptures are had among our Abrahamic cousins in Islam. So Islam inherited those same issues, and they also are grabbing hold of ideas like Augustine had, so in other words, that God is not limited by temporal concerns. Yes, Shaheen. Can you get the microphone to Shaheen?
What's in the picture?
The Kaaba.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is more of an Asherite or now a Sunni viewpoint.
Yes.
And it's very different from the Shia and the Mu'tazilite viewpoints, which very, very strongly emphasized free will.
Yes. So, okay. Absolutely. But actually, so we're going to get there. I haven't gotten to that view. I haven't even said a viewpoint yet. So anyway, so emphasizing God's will, even so, I think is fairly core to Islam in general. In other words, by saying God willing is, for example, is something that is a very common phrase in Islam. Anyway, so there is a sense, especially, as opposed to Christianity is a lot more loosey-goosey in terms of the divine, because we actually have a trinity of 3 persons, and it's very confusing. Islam is like there's one God. And God, it's much more simple in terms of we're able to say what's going on in terms of some of these operations. That's all I mean to say by this. And so there is this idea, the interpretation of what is going on in this idea, I'm going to agree, is completely different in the different branches of Islam. But I think that there's this idea that everything that God has written and everything that will be happening is in a preserved tablet, and so that requires just the idea that there is such a thing, and that there is a powerful God that we're kind of focusing monotheistically on, who has a lot of power and will, and possibly also is all-knowing in the sense that everything that's ever happened has been written in a preserved tablet. That just, all I'm going to say about that is it simply requires more effort for the theologians to preserve space for free will. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't do it. So there are very wide-ranging interpretations, as Shaheen has said, within Islamic theology that ran the whole gamut from radical libertarianism to all the way to very hard determinism. And so one of the different ways, if I understand it, in the Shiite tradition is that there are essentially two different kinds of destinies, that there is an eternal destiny that God is definitely foreordained, that's important, but that's not really relevant to the kind of free will activities that we're doing in our changeable destiny. But God is aware of both of those, so it doesn't actually limit, anyway, God's foreknowledge, right? But anyway, it also is very important, a compatibilist view that is not hard determinist in any sense. Okay, so one of the hadith here is going to just be the lazy argument. So one of the things that people have when there is this concern about, let's say, everything is according to God's will, is they're going to say, well, why are we doing anything then, right? And so here it is. Ali narrated that one day, the messenger of Allah, so the prophet, was sitting with a wooden stick in his hand in which he was scratching the ground. He raised his head and said, "There is none of you but has his place assigned either in the fire or in paradise." They, the companions, inquired, "O Allah's messenger, why should we carry on doing good deeds? Shall we depend upon qadar," which might be fate, it might be predestination, anyway, however it's translated, depending on how you think about it, "and give up work?" Muhammad said, "No, carry on doing good deeds, for everyone will find it easy to do such deeds that will lead him towards that for which he has been created." So this is representing here, again, this kind of a compatibilism. It may well be that, that there is a decree in this interpretation of this particular hadith, which doesn't mean it's universal to Islam, but anyway, within this idea of it is, you're going to be in heaven or hell. And so, how do you know you're destined though for it is, as you carry on doing your good deeds, or don't, then that's actually going to kind of show, it'll be easier or harder or whatever, it's going to kind of show the place you were going to go anyway, which indeed is sort of not even that different from, as we'll see later in Calvinism, where Calvinists also believe, it's a kind of Protestantism, they also believe very strongly in predestination, that everybody is already either damned or the elect based entirely on God's creative decision at the beginning. And so what they're always concerned with, always, and why they're always, the Calvinists are always really nervous and freaked out, is that they always are nervous that they're going to find signs that they are one of the elect. And so they want to see kind of things. If they find themselves doing bad things or whatever, then it's a bad sign that they're not one of the elect. Whereas if, unfortunately, this can also lead to the prosperity gospel. If they keep on getting all these blessings, and everything keeps on happening good, and they become rich and that kind of stuff, well, that pretty shows that they were elect, And so anyway, that kind of a thing can happen too. Shaheen.
There's another hadith that addresses the same thing, and it says that when Muhammad was asked about fate and free will, he said, "Trust in God, but tie up your camel."
Yeah, so that's God helps those who helps themselves, right? Is one of those things too, right? Trust in God, but lock the car, right? Yeah, exactly. So there you go. Okay, so I'm just going to say that those same ideas, as they're kind of wrestled with in Islam and actually going through and very much elaborated in Muslim philosophers and theologians, when their commentaries along with Aristotle get re-injected into the Latin West, they kind of make their way to Thomas Aquinas. And so I'm just pulling all the way up to him because he might be if you're going to get to a compatibilist formulation, this is going to be the one you're going to get, and otherwise maybe you're not. We'll see. But Aquinas is usually, this is kind of where it's running. So medieval, philosophical, he's essentially the synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity, and also everything that Muslim theology also told to the Christian theologians. So he writes, "Free will is the cause of its own movement." So there is a cause here. So we're talking about, we went back to, remember the Stoics when they were talking about whether anything can have a cause without having another cause before it, right? So he's suggesting free will is the cause of its own movement because by their free will, people move themselves to act, but it does not, of necessity, belong to liberty, that what is free should be the first cause of itself. As neither, for one thing, to be the cause of another, need it be the first cause. So, in other words, you did act in free will to do whatever you did in terms of the apple and the cupcake, right? But there was something before that happened before that, and so anyway, it means that this is not. It's the most recent cause that is causing you to that is the voluntary cause, right? Is according to him. So God, therefore, is the first cause. So then all the way back in the chain, we're going to have God as the causation, not in the more recent voluntary cause, who moves causes both natural and voluntary. So God is the first cause of everything that is a voluntary in nature and everything that is, let's say, the nature in natural processes in terms of life. And just as by moving natural causes, he does not prevent their acts from being natural, so the fact that God is the cause of trees growing and rain falling and all that kind of thing, that doesn't make that unnatural, the fact that he's the cause of it, according to Aquinas. So, by moving voluntary causes, he does not deprive their actions of being voluntary, but rather is he the cause of this very thing in them, their freedom, for he operates in each thing according to its nature. So the cause that God is causing, according to Aquinas, is voluntariness itself. So this is his compatibilism. So whether or not you're going to like this one any better than any of the other ones we've had so far, I just thought, okay, if we can get to one, we'll get to that one. So this is Aquinas's. And so that's kind of, I want to talk of one last little way by an analogy or by an appeal to kind of human sensibility. So we started with our idea that we naturally have this intuitive sense that we have free will. We are harder pressed to immediately get the idea of determinism, but I think we do understand this idea of causation, and it certainly has been with us all the way back, whether it was by fate or karma, providence, predestination, all these other kinds of things. And I would also suggest is that another thing that is with us is human narrative and how we understand things best as people by storytelling, or that we always tell stories in order to try to get to understanding. And so I want to look at how free will and determinism work as a tension in human narratives. So if we have, this is just fiction, so if we have a story like The Watchmen on HBO, it could be any number of things, our narrative begins and we have characters who, from the audience perspective, let's say, have a number of potential outcomes that are going to depend on their actions in the whole arc of the story, right? As the narrative, progresses, some of these possibilities are ruled out. They're not going to go that way because they missed that path, right? And so we're kind of following along, not sure, or maybe trying to think about what's going to happen here, what's going to happen to these folks. So a good author will already have known what the ending is going to be, even though we're still anticipating it, right? So the author will, especially, let's say you're a mystery writer, the idea is you write the solution down first and then you figure out how to make it mysterious, right? So everybody wants it to end in a wedding. That's where it's going to happen, according to this kind of a story. So we know that the author knows, but we don't know where it's going to go. Okay, that author, she will have foreshadowed that outcome, and so in so doing prepared the audience for it when it occurs, even though we don't know it. However, to keep the narrative suspense, good foreshadowing is ambiguous and points to other potential outcomes. All these other ones. So anyway, the suspense continues as more potential resolutions get ruled out as the thing gets further along, until when we get to that, whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending, we get to a satisfying ending because it's something that we saw as reasonably moving from the other. So these guys were making all these decisions. These different possibilities seemed open, but at a certain point, it did get to the one that was foreshadowed, or one of the ones that was foreshadowed, and therefore we find that satisfying and meaningful as narrative. And I'm going to say that works really well in HBO's Watchmen. So they did a good job. The writer knew where they were going and went there the whole time. The narrative was only suspenseful because at the outset there seemed to be these multiple potential outcomes. The outcome is only satisfying and meaningful because the author knew where the narrative was going and was able to prepare the audience through the foreshadowing. So if an author were going to write this story about these little cute robots, and they're really cute, they're completely subject, though, to their programming, and they're programmed to do a particular given task, and they don't have any actually alternative alt paths. So when they get there, it actually doesn't really matter how, it says reboots robots, it doesn't matter really how cute they are, because no tension is possible. So people don't usually write stories like this because there's nothing to follow, right? The robots would just simply do what they're doing always, and they get to their solution. The story will have been boring and pointless. What about if you have a story, we won't say what story we're talking about here, where the author is really lazy and a hack, and anyway, let's say, but there's no predetermined outcome. So what about the story where literally anything is possible because the author hasn't bothered to figure out how the story will end before starting to write it or film it? So then what'll happen is, Game of Thrones is another one we could have done this with, yeah. So they don't know where I was going. Sadly, very sadly. I don't know why writers think that they can. Why wouldn't you write the end first and not do this? Because you're a hack. That's why for J.J. So anyway, so this is what J.J. Abrams' mystery box, right? So in other words, he knows how to trick the audience into being suspenseful. You want to know what's going to happen to all these people on Lost, and that kind of a thing. But whereas, so they're doing that, and there's all these things happening. When you finally get to the end, and it doesn't almost matter what happened at the end because it's totally meaningless because all of the foreshadowing were hollow, just tricks, and the outcome is essentially random, right? So this way also, the totally free willy one also isn't satisfying, right? So anyway, I'm just really mad about this. So anyway, if you can imagine. So anyway, I was just going to say that when we do this, anyway, for us in our human sensibilities, this is not trying to say that this is how the universe works in any kind of way, but I'm trying to get to where and why, even though it is very hard to formulate compatibilism, why there's something why people always, I think, maybe are landing here and why we have an appeal for it. So compatibilism then, into this as opposed to the free will that's random and meaningless, or the determinism that is also meaningless and boring. Anyway, this is why I think we innately have a pitch and want to get to compatibilism, but I still got to study a lot more of it in order to be convinced by any of the compatibilists, and we're hopefully going to get to that when we do the next part of this, because this one, as we said, is beginnings. And so when we have our next one, is there more? Is that the last slide?
Could be.
Oh, okay. Well, I lost the last slide. But anyway, when we get to the next one, it's part 2, and I promise I will get out of the Middle Ages. And so, in other words, we got through the Middle Ages, and now we'll begin with the development of free will and determinism philosophically, beginning in the early modern period and trying to bring it up to the present. So thank you very much. Do we have questions?
Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I just wonder, I came a bit late as well, maybe that's the reason, and I'm very new to this gathering.
Uh-huh.
It's very nice to exercise our minds and understanding these, talking about different ideas. I wanted to understand a bit more about if you're looking for a goal in this series, or if you're looking for truth in this way, or it's just more it might be for some people like that, or
Yeah.
how would you see that? How would you explain?
Yeah, so I would say that our, as we stated, like at the beginning with our mission, it includes such things as continually learn and grow, and also live life meaningfully together. And so one of the ways that, again, I'm trying to present these is usually to give us, when we are trying to like approach something that's a major philosophical question, is not to, I mean, I'll share if we come to a place where I've really been able to decide on something because somebody really grabbed me. But in the meantime, what my real goal is to put it within just a really broad context so we can kind of get a grounding with it. I tend to like to present things, I usually give too much context, and so that's when we don't always get to the present day, for example, because we did so much grounding in antiquity and that kind of a thing. But we'll get there eventually. And so the idea of it is, I feel like if we know where ideas kind of have had their roots, we can understand them more. And in fact, when we may have gotten to, in some cases, what might be dead ends in thinking, one of the cases that is that we're always, as we're coming up with new ideas, sometimes we have to go back and re-examine how we got to the path that we got to. And so what I am trying to do in this particular topic, we've had several people for a couple of years actually who are parts of the group who wanted to address this one, and I have too, because I myself struggle with this question of free will and determinism, because I have an innately feel like I want to think that there's free will. And yet I'm very, I find that determinists often have some very interesting and plausible and very strong arguments, and especially when we get to even modernity, there's a bunch of more pretty serious ones that can be even things like biological, as we kind of are seeing that there's evidence that that some of these decisions are being made, speaking of like the Matrix or whatever, that if we're operating if we're thinking of ourselves operating in the decision-making part, that in fact, what may be happening, according to some studies, is that some of these decisions are already being made in earlier portions of our nervous system and brains, and that in fact what our top-level cognition is doing is explaining, because it has to come up with explanations all the time, it's explaining to ourselves why we did the thing that we did, but it may not be the thing that is actually, and it's explaining it by saying, well, I made that choice. But it may not be actually a true explanation, and so we may well have been making that. And so anyway, because those are actually very serious issues, because it ultimately then has very grave ethical issues. So for example, if we are in a place where we, you may well think that if a person is being imprisoned or punished for actions, if those actions really were fully determined, if there is no if we are hard determinists and there is no free will at all, or if there's no compatibilism, how can they possibly be a moral agent that is deserving of punishment ethically? It may well be that we would have to, we can, as a society, come up with explanations or justifications for societal safety about why we have to contain people who are going to be harmful to others in certain places or whatever, but it would certainly have very different, there would be very serious ramifications. And I'm not saying that I'm certainly not in favor actually of retributive justice anyway, but in other words, that would definitely be out of the question, you'd think, if there is no moral agency. Yeah. Oh. No, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to give a definition of the relationship between what I call necessity and free will in relationship to chaos theory.
Okay.
I'll offer, I hope, a simple, clear explanation.
You're right.
Okay, she's going to
try. There's something called the coastline paradox, which has to do with how you measure an indented coastline, say like the coastline of England.
Yep.
And what they found out, without going through a lot of any of the mathematics of it, is that depending upon how much detail you want to include in your measurement, that will affect how long the length of the how long the coastline is. It will determine the value of the length of the coastline. Right. So that the more detail you include in your measurement, you'll find out, contrary to common sense, the longer will be the length of the coastline.
Yeah.
All right, so now the logic of it is that ultimately, if you want to measure the coastline with an infinite number of detail, which you'll never get at except at infinity, the value will be only determined at infinity.
Okay. Yeah.
So that means to say that the value that you get is a function of your decision, i.e. your free will,
Yeah.
to choose a certain level of detail that you want, and that's strictly your free will because it has nothing to do with the model itself, nothing to do with the structure.
Yep.
So here's my definition of the relationship between what I call necessity and free will. So necessity here is the given, or the present, what's there, with the big, I guess, P or big D, the data or the given.
Uh-huh.
And free will refers to how you open up the present.
Ah.
Right? So you have the present and then how you open it up.
Yeah.
And you can open up with thinking and thanking, or without thanks. But anyway, it's how the matter of opening would be the matter of free will.
Yeah.
So that's my definition.
I think that's
to
interesting.
ponder.
Yeah. Thank you. I like that. Yeah.
So as you go through this lecture presentation, it sort of made me remember some of the many instances in my life in which I was wondering if the moments I was experiencing was a matter of free will or determinism. But in any case, because essentially, long story short, I was traveling for almost 5 years, and to say that the journey was rather biblical, in my opinion, would be an understatement, both in good and bad ways. But at one point, I wrote something I called The Cost of Freedom.
Okay.
And I just wanted to share like the opening line I wrote, and it was, I don't know where I wrote this, but I said, recently I've come to the realization that my life is a cautionary tale, an allegory, if you will, as to why man was never meant to eat from the tree of knowledge. Ironically, it was my religious upbringing that had marketed the attainment of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding as a noble pursuit, as if the ruin that befell Adam and Eve upon the opening of their eyes was devoid of an important lesson. And because I just remember feeling at one point in time that enlightenment felt like a prison more than anything else. And so that's what inspired me to write that.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Can I just make a comment on
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, and to me, when you said enlightenment is like a prison, it makes me think of like knowledge is power, but it's also ignorance is bliss.
Right. Yeah.
You know, so sometimes one wonders whether or not you really want to know more of something. But I was going to mention something. I don't know. I'm very new to this, so
okay.
You'll have to, pardon me, it's more in lay terms. I'm trying to think of where science comes into this and our physical bodies and where we come from primally, and how that our primal, I forget what it's called, but there's a primal part of the brain that is always there, and how that determines so many things that we end up doing in life that we don't even realize. Like we call ourselves human, but I don't know who it was said we are only animals attempting to be human, kind of thing. But also a lot of what I wrote some things down. What was mentioned made me think of constantly trying to turn chaos into order. Anyway.
Yeah. So I would say, in terms of an ancient and medieval desire and value was trying to turn chaos into order, and so there is this inheritance in the paganism of like feeling like everything is chaotic, and all of the Greco-Roman moral philosophies, I think, are trying to understand the universe to have order in it, and those then give way to Abrahamic religions, and certainly this is also true in the Eastern traditions too, of trying to have that. And in terms of what do we know about brainstem and everything like that, function about having that be, this is going to be in the next lecture when we're getting to the modern ideas of it. I can say is that in the past they did have what they called natural philosophy, which is the precursor to modern science. But they just aren't as aware of all of those things. It doesn't mean, though, that they don't have observation, and so both Aristotle and I think also Aquinas have what they kind of call, there's 3 levels of motivation, which they do by analogy to be vegetative, animal, and human, or and so that there is the things that we're doing just to breathe or something like that, which is like vegetative, what plants can do. There's the being able to react instinctively and have into pain and that kind of thing, and it can be trained like a dog can be trained. And then there's this extra level that they're identifying as the place for actual free will, where you are making choices between alternatives as opposed to just acting out of animal instinct or simply vegetatively breathing. And so they didn't know about all brainstem and everything like that, but they were at least thinking that way and on some of those terms.
And if I can just mention one more thing, it's not long. Recent political events over the past number of years and things in my past sort of brought me to this thought of scenery changes, but human nature remains the same. We seem to be on this constant wheel of learning and going back to, I kind of call it Groundhog Day. I sort of feel like I'm living Groundhog Day constantly.
Yeah. Well, I was going to include in this one of the other ideas that was in antiquity that's related to fate and also makes its way very strongly into the Middle Ages is the idea of Fortuna of Fortune. And Lady Fortune is constantly turning her wheel. And so sometimes you're up and sometimes then we're also down. And so certainly sometimes you feel like, boy, history, if it's not repeating itself, at least it's having resonances as we continue to have what we think we should know better in terms of if we just studied what went before, but we don't always do that. And so we end up having a repeat or a resonance.
Well, I guess if more people had an
it's actually to her behind.
If more people had an understanding of history, then they might know not to repeat.
Yeah. So she's been waiting. I'm sorry. So yeah.
That's okay.
Yes, exactly. Right.
No,
if more people studied history.
Yeah, I actually find it, first of all, thank you so much. It's very comprehensive and very stimulating. And I find it interesting that people were sort of commenting on things that I kind of had in my mind. I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering too. So you answered a few of my questions already. And particularly the concept of how do we incorporate something that is perhaps more scientific or material in terms of neuroscience, quantum physics, et cetera, but also noticing how sort of philosophical ruminations are rather limited, and we're assuming that a greater reality operates at the same level of the human mind in terms of what it can conceive. But most of us can only conceive of something that's limited, and finite, whereas reality is limitless and infinite. And so how do we kind of integrate and allow there to be like an infinite expansion of these philosophical concepts? And then she also mentioned the nature of, I'm not sure how she put it, but basically it's almost like the scenery is changing, but we're always the same. And I was thinking about like the fractal nature from a mathematical perspective of the unified field in terms of how the input is the output and the output is the input. And it's like this constant thing, and yet it's infinite depending on what scale that you conceive of it. So I don't know, it's a bit of like a reflection. I'm not sure what you want to, rather
That's
than
fine.
a whole question.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, definitely. So what I would say about it in terms of when we're going to get to more materialism, there's no doubt that that really when we get to modernity, and so when we're going to get where we are all the way here through the end of Aquinas and all of the antiquity before that, is that we really are focusing on ancient thinkers that are, in a lot of cases, idealists as opposed to materialists, and that it's really going to be with when people start really doubting that, and Descartes, and we're getting after that to empiricism, and ultimately we get to very serious radical materialism, where we are denying the kind of this immaterial world of the past, and instead are really focusing on material reality. That this is going to be the centerpiece of the thought in the early modern, up till modern times. And so yeah, we'll be talking about all that. So that'll be really great. And I just appreciate the other comments. So yes.
Hi. I don't want to anticipate your next lecture, and perhaps you'll deal with it then. But I came across something a while ago that was kind of interesting. It talked about how when you make a decision, it is determined by the past, your experience, and by your list of options, because you can't really make a decision unless you have, one of 5 options, or whether you decide whether your peer group is going to approve of this, so that you generally choose something that's going to be good for yourself and good for your peer group. But the joker in the pack is when you start alcohol and hallucinogenics, then you sort of turn the wheel of fortune and you sort of break that cycle, and it's not free will anymore. It's your going into neutral and letting the world act upon you, and then it's basically you're not listening. And that's sort of like the development of free will, and somebody has posited and written books, I suppose, about how in the ancient times it was the origin of consciousness was through the ancients taking their hallucinogenics and all that in order to develop a free will, or rather determine their own free will.
Mm. Well, so what I will say about, we've had lectures here before, for example, when Michael Ferguson came, who is a neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School, and he gave a lecture on how, for example, there's all kinds of different ways you can create different neural networks that will have different kinds of consciousness, so that when you are, for example, engaged in mindfulness meditation, what you normally would see the brain light up in a cat machine would be doing this, but then now suddenly, when the Tibetan monks are doing it, something else is happening. And that can also happen with hallucinogens. So in other words, there's not that, it's not necessarily like, shamans thought in the ancient times that you are really necessarily in touch with spirit world, that it has an actual, it doesn't have a physical existence, but anyway, but it may well be, though, that you actually are achieving a different kind of neural net created consciousness, because it's actually firing differently. So even though it's your same brain cells, you're maybe doing different things with them, and so that is giving you a different perception. Where the other part was, I got off track. So we were talking about, so in terms of like addiction and getting into that. So one of the things that that is going to come into the debate, so these ideas of compatibilism are going to get a lot more sophisticated because of the objections get more sophisticated. And so one of the more recent modern philosophers has entered into this idea of, well, maybe you have different orders of desire. So on the one hand, you have kind of a free will that you want to stop drinking alcohol, but you have the desire that you want to go back to, have a drink. And so it may well be that you have different orders of desire, or let's say if in that case it's also addiction is playing in, which is affecting whether or not you have the free will. And so maybe you only had free will back at the beginning when you made this choice that led to of you getting to be in that condition, is what they might argue. May not, I don't know. And then another possibility is let's say if it's you were talking about ones of like social conformity or something like that. You have different orders of desire. I want to be true to myself, but my friends aren't going to like me. And so in other words, you may have different orders of motivation and things like that. And that'll be something we also will explore. So, yeah. Go ahead. You're right next to it. Go ahead. You've got the microphone. You can talk.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Okay, do this.
Yeah. All right. Just a thought, and then maybe following with a question.
Yeah.
The whole idea that we are talking about and thinking about free will is that we're trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And we are lacking the tools to some extent. And in history, there are numerous examples that we couldn't understand. We went through our thoughts, philosophy, and I'm not challenging philosophy or anything like that, just saying that, for instance, we were not able to understand how Earth works, right? Like we were thinking it's flat, then science came and cleared it out with proofs, right? And then other examples, like we can talk about density, we can talk about multiple topics. Like one of the things that when I was in high school, I was hearing a lot, was about chemistry, like that was saying philosophy delayed the invention of the modern chemistry till like 16th or 18th century, like thinking of, okay, all the matter has been made of four, matters,
Right.
for those type
Yep.
of. So coming to this, like, all right, we don't understand at this point what free will is, and some scientists are tackling it, like neuroscientists, saying, okay, these are all. Coming to this question that, are we gonna, I don't want to jump ahead of our series, are we gonna discuss these, or
Yes.
how would you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely we're going to get there. There's all kinds of different, especially in modern times, this has to become interdisciplinary, and indeed, let's say the core action, and where the action is in this field, probably, like we were just talking about with neuroscience and previous lecture we had on that topic, is really left the philosophers a little bit behind, and so, but I will do a little bit of pushback that I do think that whereas we have in modern times gone through this whole long period of where we're really focused on materialism, I think that there is also in the postmodern times that we kind of have been in, there has been an understanding about how important actually ideas and paradigm and framework are as well, and how, and so I'm not saying that materialism isn't important and material stuff, but I do think there's a reason to also look at the evolution of the ideas and getting there and how they're grounded. But I totally agree with you that one of the things that can happen when you have an amazing scientist or natural philosopher like Aristotle, who was able to create a unified theory of how everything works that includes that elements are air, earth, fire, and water, and ether, then it might take you 1900 years to get over it, and then, because, even though, like in some cases with some of the things that Aristotle said and wrote, if you'd actually just gone outside and like Galileo did and dropped two different weighted objects from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you'd find out that they didn't actually, the heavier one didn't hit first, depending on whatever air friction and that kind of a thing. The way he said it did, because he had an incorrect theory of motion. It may well be, though, that actually Galileo didn't actually do that. He just did it as a thought experiment. But in any event, there are power to those kind of ideas. So yeah, Valerie. Oh no, you had the microphone. I'm sorry. You already had the microphone, so you didn't have to raise your hand. Sorry.
Right,
go.
yeah. So the idea or the feeling of free will certainly seems potent to us as humans. It seems gripping. But I also hear you when you talk about neuroscience and the studies that are coming out that, seem to say that, maybe things aren't as freely chosen as we would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if, we come to a point in the scientific literature that does seem much more to lean to the side of, a lot of the things that we think we choose ourselves are actually pre-chosen subconsciously or that sort of thing. But given that we feel so strongly that we choose to do these things, like I can choose to snap my finger, like that feels like I chose it. I wonder if the science does show what I was postulating, how is it that we would hold those two together? And I guess maybe if I could liken it to this parallel of, like many Christians and maybe other people who are of faith would say that, even if it came to light that, the scriptures or somewhat were forged and, there's no truth to it, the historicity, etc. A lot of people would say, well, I feel a relationship with this personal God, etc., and would be like, well, I'm going to go with my relationship. So I wonder how it is that we would... what you think would be somewhat how do we make sense of that at the time?
I'll say that one, I don't think that the physical science has gotten to the point where it's really totally conclusive and we've made the case where we know for sure that it's deterministic. I think that they've got some pretty compelling arguments, is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, but nevertheless, let's say even in the case of some folks who are, let's say, coming at it from the physical science realm and who have become, let's say, convinced hard determinists, several of them will still say, But you should go on believing that you're making these choices because it maybe has had good effects on your life and society and all these kind of things. Whether or not that's good enough, whether or not people can still be there. It's anyway. So that's kind of where we're kind of going as we kind of explore that. But I'm going to say that don't give up hope, because I don't know that we've put a lid on this. I think there's some jury still out, and there's some interesting things to look into. Okay, now Valerie.
I was just going to sort of talk further on this idea that philosophy held up the progress of science for a very long time, with with sort of false notions like the humors and other such, whether Aristotelian or other Platonic ideas. But I wasn't here right at the beginning, and I'm wondering, whether you spent a little bit of time on the atomists and Democritus and Epicurus. Okay. Yeah, so there was the whole other thread in the origins of Western philosophy with the Greeks. And so the atomists, and represented particularly by the philosopher Democritus, believed that all of reality is material and is made of indivisible little invisible bits called atoms. That's why they were called atomists. And so because the atoms interacted in patterns, therefore the world being material and patterned is deterministic. And so
so the gods have no point because the gods can't do anything because it's all happening based on random. And they did struggle with how then, do we talk about the possibility of free will, considering all of that. And so they came up with various strategies to make it compatible. The later atomist, materialist Epicurus proposed that there is a indeterminacy in the action of the atoms, which he called the, quote, swerve, unquote, which gave the possibility of some, not so much randomness, but let's say opening to the, sort of to the rules not being so rule-bound. And the atomist philosophy was very frowned upon by the early Christians for various reasons, including that it did not really cohere with their ideas of what God can do and what God is. And so they suppressed atomist philosophy powerfully until the rediscovery of the Greek writings as preserved by the Islamic world in the late Middle Ages. And so the earliest chemists in Europe were sourcing, well, not the alchemists, but the beginnings of science in the late Renaissance and early modern period was very much influenced by the rediscovery of these ancient philosophical atomists. So philosophy does not necessarily mean just this wrong turn, but rather also that there was an aspect of Greek philosophy that was powerfully suppressed. Well, and included in that stream, the Islamic theologians and philosophers that were busily reinventing scientific method and things like that then get pulled in by those early modern Westerners that pull that kind of thing in. So it doesn't have to be a bad turn. So certainly what ended up happening, I think everyone can agree that as I think that the initial rediscovery of Aristotle and the focus on logic that happens in the 12th and 13th century in the West is really, really good for learning. But when people get stuck in that and they can't get past it in the 1600s, and it's built into the curriculum, people get punished for doing anything besides it, then that obviously is where it's totally atrophied and is not a good thing anymore. So, okay, let's break.
I came in a little late, and I missed the first screen. I think it was about the jailer.
Yeah.
Can you show that again?
Sure. I know, but I've lost control of the screen. Okay, we got to wait.